Thank you. So today the topic is low code, no code, and I have a really good panel here today that will help us do a bit of myth busting when it comes down to some of the myths and fallacies that exist around low code, no code platforms. But I want to kind of just start us off and set kind of the tone of today's session. So these days, the low code term has been slapped on any piece of software that includes some element of what's called visual programming. But the problem is that low code software tools are bunched into one category. For instance, an enterprise web application development tool can be considered low code, but so can a website builder. So, so can a process automation tool or software be also kind of lumped into that category. Basically, any type of software that uses a point and click interface to generate code is considered in the low code categorization. So hopefully those of you that are on this call today in this webinar see a bit of a problem with that. Where I'd like to kind of shift us to is that low code started as a way to define web application development tools, and it's since spread to many and to many different types of tools, many of which are unrelated. And so the platforms, that being said, the platforms vary widely from one to the next. Some are simpler and only provide basic functions, while others are more kind of enterprise class and offer a wide range of features. So today, this panel and I are hopefully going to dispel, but mostly discuss many of the common myths we hear about low-code tools. And we're going to focus on the original definition of low-code, which is about a web application development platforms that you can create applications with a minimum of hand coding. Sound good? So let's get into it. Our panel today includes Aaron Alexander. He's the Assistant Chief Information Security Officer for Marketing and Regulatory Programs at the Department of Agriculture. We have Michael Gardner. He is the current president of Granville Systems. And Michael is a former deputy CIO and former Chief Information Security Officer in the federal government. We also are joined today by George Cleek, a former federal executive responsible for some really large, impactful programs at the Department of Agriculture, who has since retired and is now the vice president at TSPi. And lastly, not bringing up the rear, but definitely, one of our esteemed panelists, Matt Goodrich, who is currently the head of transformation at Schellman. And Matt is also a former Fed and used to support the FedRAMP office. So that's our panel today. And so we're going to get into it. This is going to be completely discussion style for the folks that have joined the webinar today. Full disclosure, I have worked with all of these gentlemen in one capacity or another. So we know each other, and if you hear us kind of argue a little bit and go back and forth, that's because there's already kind of an established relationship. So let's get right into kind of some of the topics that we're going to touch on today, which hopefully piques your interest, and I'm asking you to certainly join in the chat. So we're going to talk about kind of 7 major topics, the first of which are around kind of all low-code tools are not the same. This concept that around vendor lock-in, we tend to hear that here and there when it comes to customers' concerns, but also data strategy and integration strategy being paramount to using platforms. That's another kind of theme of the discussion. Moving right into security and compliance, which certainly gets many people's attentions when they're talking about cloud native platforms. followed by this notion or concept that I see kind of spreading across the federal government, and a lot of interest in citizen development. And bringing up the rear is operations and maintenance when it comes to low code, no code platforms. And many customers may believe that there is no O&M required, no need, especially business programs, thinking that the technology office may or may not be required. So let's get right into it, gentlemen. Let's start talking about modernization efforts and why all low code tools aren't the same. And specifically, let's talk about low code in the space of like mission applications, mission critical applications, and why organizations, government organizations may want to consider a low code platform with a mission critical application versus traditional custom development. So jump right in, gentlemen.
I mean, I'm happy to start. I think one thing that makes low code, no code so different, and what you'll see in almost any of the advertisements for any of the vendors that do it, is its speed to delivery. Usually in what we're seeing in today's world, the idea that a mission critical app has longer than 6 months to launch is very rare, right? If there's a mission critical need, it's usually either new or there's something that's failing that's requiring you to move there. And so I think that's where the sort of low code, no code companies and offerings really come into play, is that idea of that speed to market and speed to meeting that mission critical need and doing that. And I think what we're seeing with a lot of the modernization efforts is that not only combined from the idea of moving from sort of legacy or traditional on-prem into something new that's faster, more agile, is also that we're just seeing a drastic change in the way that people are working. I mean, we saw that with COVID. I know we're all tired of that word and we say it way too much still, but it's still a reality of a hybrid workforce. And that really created a real sea change in the ways that employees and constituents in government interact with the government. And so I think the ability to meet those new needs of where people are, these platforms really give the ability to meet that need much faster than a traditional development cycle. So I think that's why we see a lot of people moving there. I don't see it as much for long-standing traditional on-prem mission critical apps, because typically you have kind of a longer runway for that transformation, if you will. That doesn't mean I'm not seeing that happen. It's just not usually sort of in that same vein. But that's where I think I'm seeing a lot more of the need for this, is that like little pieces of mission critical need that need to get out there really fast.
I totally agree. I mean, let me speak to this fact that, when we're talking about mission critical applications, in many cases, those are public facing to some extent, that require the processing of, an intake process of some sort, where on the end of that process, some benefit, some service is delivered, right? And so with low code platforms, really kind of simplifying what I will call the business process, I think that's where the real kind of bread and butter, really comes into play with, if we can remember, those of us that have worked in government, many of those systems, you may have an application that's public facing, but then you've built another application behind it to do kind of all of the workflow. Remember that, George? That you have to build to kind of actually handle all of that intake, that review, that assessment, and then ultimately like distribution of some kind of benefit. Often those applications are disjointed. There's a bit of friction between them. The technologies that are used often in those systems are not necessarily always the same or on the same par level. And so that requires, a lot of care and feeding of those things, that when you make one change in one system, you end up needing to make a change in another. They can be different vendors. And so it just becomes very, very complicated, and your systems end up being very rigid. Would you all agree with that?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that struck me of what you're saying too is the idea, though, that a lot of these mission critical needs, like getting benefits out there or engaging with the public and things like that, they aren't truly as unique as what agencies originally thought they were. because they were operating in silos and developing and building themselves and creating these kind of unique ways they were doing it. But in general, they're relatively generic processes that have a specific need and outcome, but the process to get there is relatively similar. And I think that's what's kind of cool. This is forcing some of that modernization thought around, is what you're doing truly unique? Like, you want to believe it is because we were told we were special from the moment we were born by our parents, but like that process isn't necessarily truly unique. It's just what you use it for. So,
George, what are you seeing specifically at TSPi when you are supporting your customers and they're thinking about mission critical applications?
Thanks, Leah, for inviting me. Love to be here and help out. So, general question, excellent, which is what we often hear and see is the customers that are coming to us. Our approach is fairly straightforward, which is sit down, understand their needs and their challenges, and then offer to them a palette, basically a menu of different options on how to be successful at meeting those needs or challenges. And within that palette, of course, are low-code, no-code platforms, in addition to other traditional app dev methodologies. And what we typically see, in to echo what Matt said, the primary reason is everyone wants to modernize, but how do we get it done? And the thing that we can show repeatedly over and over again is the time to market for the first MVP. And then from there, it just totally blooms and blossoms. Back to the concept of every agency thinks that they're unique and that their systems are so unique that only XYZ can deliver on that end. And not necessarily true. Even though like myself, I had a passion for a certain platform for a certain reason to go forward and realize that it's not everything for everybody. Mm-hmm. So I hope that answers your question as far as come in, understand the challenges, especially mission critical, and then offer the right portfolio or suite of products for them that include no code, no low code. And then what we traditionally also see is that in order to solve the major challenges and issues and get to that first MVP conversation, is you may implement one or two or three, because not one does everything that the customer wants to meet from end to end. Right. So you might have an integration of multiple low-code, no-code platforms, and that seems to be what we're looking at now.
Yeah, I like that. Many times, when people are seeking or needing to address a legacy system and wanting to modernize, and they move to or they select a no-code, low-code platform, what we see a lot from time to time is this notion of kind of treating that platform as if it's a point solution. Right. So I'm going to use some examples, right? I need a correspondence system, or, I need some kind of, I need a system to do FOIA or things of that. And so what we see is, repeatedly RFIs and RFPs going out over and over and over again, asking for, a very, very specific solution without kind of thinking about like, what are the underlying capabilities that I need, and how do I select a platform that gives me a variety of capabilities that meet my enterprise needs? Michael, in our huddle the other day, Michael did a great job of kind of, I think, describing what he called like a full stack, right? When you're kind of considering a low code, no code platform and doing, the traditional analysis of alternatives. And he broke it down into, these platforms often are made up of web pages or allow you to develop web pages, produce screens. There's underlying workflow. There's a need for a rules engine. There are APIs, and then you need data from likely many legacy systems. That kind of full stack, right, is really, and that description, I think, really made me realize that when you think about kind of those things in a very basic sense, that those capabilities can be reused over and over and over and over again, and many times in government organizations, because you're kind of doing, many of the applications you have require those components. And so going out looking for point solutions can be quite costly, and you end up not getting the full ROI, right, out of an enterprise platform buy. Michael, you want to add?
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, and you're, these considerations have to go into your app rationalization strategy on the government side. It's like, you've got these capabilities in the marketplace, as I described before. This full stack of capabilities on one hand, but then you got all of these sort of legacy applications that you want to modernize / get rid of, and well, nobody ever gets rid of an application. I laughed when you said correspondence system. Yeah, I was like, really, Mia? So it's one of those things, right? It's like, again, you've got this full stack on one hand, and you've got your enterprise on the other. And if you're going to, make the investment in a low code solution, you probably want to cast the widest net across, the various kinds of apps and data sources you want to modernize. Otherwise, why spend the millions of dollars for a point-to-point solution?
That's right. We got a question in the chat from Mary Jean. She says, interesting comments on that there is not one size fit all, but similarities between agency needs. Please elaborate. She says on the platform, but we're talking about many different platforms. And she says, do agencies run the risk of having multiple low code, no code platforms that may not talk to each other, i.e. low code, no code silos? And I want to just start with this. I think, fit for purpose is a term that's used in government often. And I think really understanding the differences between your low code, no code investments, what they do really well, what they do not so well, is important to addressing your question. I think interoperability kind of is what I would call kind of a basic criteria, Mary Jean, when you're thinking about your investments into multiple platforms. Are there native APIs and integrations, right? As an example, when you're going to make that purchase, that's critical. And I think in every purchasing decision, when you're talking about cloud, interoperability and flexibility is paramount. But I'm going to let the rest of the team kind of jump in on answering your question, Mary Jean. Anybody else want to chime in?
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. And Mia, thank you as well for inviting us to be on today's panel. And I have to say that, my views today are mine, not necessarily the views of the USDA or the US government. But when it comes to, that specific question, something that's very key, not necessarily specific to, cybersecurity requirements, but overall enterprise architecture. You really have to do that upfront work to make sure that if you are looking for a specific solution to solve a problem, what already exists, what are you utilizing within your current inventory or architecture and solutions, and then do they operate, on and communicate on a similar path? Meaning, we've seen this time and time again, where we see the latest and greatest toy, and it looks great, and we want to utilize it, and we stand this thing up and start operating, and oh wait, well, we still needed to connect to X, Y, and Z within our portfolio, and we can't. And these are types of things from an EA perspective that really need to be hashed out long before technical decisions are made or specific point solutions are identified to say, what can we reuse? What systems need to talk to one another before you get to that type of conclusion? Yes, today, a lot of low code, no code platforms are interoperable because you've got, one vendor who wants to take business and create business. So they'll create APIs where you can communicate, right? And say, I'm going to pluck everything out of here and move it to my platform. No worries, we have that capability. But all something that needs to be done at that level long before you get to a point where you come to a decision.
I like that. We've got some additional, anyone want to chime in, but we're getting peppered with questions. So
Sure. One last add-on, if I might, Mia, the question from the lady on, is there an opportunity for reuse of low code, no go code from a particular agency to another agency that's got a similar workflow, a similar work pattern, etc.? The answer is yes. It's not always a super easy, just lift and shift and bring it on over, because there'll have to be some level, because every agency thinks they're unique, right? I can say that. There's got to be some level of configuration and maybe some other alterations that are needed to make it fit that next situation. But there is value. We have seen it, and we can prove it, that there's value in having accelerators or MVPs that are liftable and bring it over to another agency with a couple tweaks here and there. And yes, we can get you even more speed to market by doing and leveraging that.
I would love that if the government would kind of start a working group or some kind of forum around the low code, no code platforms, where they are collaborating and communicating about what's being built at this agency, because the portability of applications, when you're talking about your requirements being, I'm going to use 60 to 70% alike, you know, the transfer, and I've been involved in one of these, the transfer of, you know, code from agency X to code to agency Y is at no cost to the government if they're doing it themselves, right? The cost becomes in that, you know, that 30 or 40% difference in requirements, you getting an SI, or my God, maybe your federal staff are trained, right, to do minimum, you know, low code, no code configuration that gets you to a final solution. We'd love to see more of that, and I think that could really accelerate progress in the federal government. We have.
Can I add one thing that I think it'd be interesting to see, though, if, I mean, there's already what is it? What's the open source code repository at GSA? It's not, is it code.gov? I think it's code.gov. But that idea of sharing open source code, I think it's been an interesting limiting view of looking at what is traditionally open source. There are vendor proprietary sort of code bases that people use. I might be speaking from experience. I'm not going to name where I used to work, but you can look it up on LinkedIn. But there are things that are being shared in places like code.gov that I think organizations like that could expand their view of what open source is. In my mind, open source is code free to use. It doesn't matter if it's on some certain proprietary type of stack. And so you'll even see at some of those, there are places where, like, say, the US web design standards, there's a code base already ready to go into those low code, no code platforms. So people don't have to start from scratch and meeting the US web design standards. Yeah. So I think there's already a small movement, but I think to your point, there's a great area where that could be much, much stronger in understanding how that could be shared and encouraging agencies to do so.
Yes. So Maruz, you have a question regarding Microsoft. I don't think that this is the correct forum to address a specific vendor. And so I'm going to move on from that question. But if you want to be put in touch with a representative from Microsoft, we can certainly make that happen. Stephen, you're taking us directly into our next theme or topic around vendor lock-in. And I often chuckle when I hear vendor lock-in and agencies using that. But your question says, you know, what does the government fear more, vendor lock-in or platform sprawl? And let me just give you my opinion on that. Whether it is a specific commercial vendor or whether it is an SI coming in doing custom development, you're locked. Consider yourself locked, okay? And I think it just really depends on what you mean by vendor lock-in. You know, and we're going to kind of get into that, but I'm going to turn it over to the panel to talk because Michael was very passionate about this topic yesterday. And so I want to give him the floor about this notion of vendor lock-in, but also how we should be thinking about flexible architectures to avoid vendor lock-in where possible. So Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm going to pick up on the theme you just mentioned a few seconds ago. Yeah, I mean, when you buy something, you're locked in, and make no mistake about it. You know, because you've committed money, you've committed time, you've committed your data, and you've committed your people to use it. So you're locked in. The question isn't about, in my mind, the question isn't about vendor lock-in. The question really is about what's the impetus and the cost to move to another platform or to another technology, right? You know, and is that so costly in terms of you know, making the transition in terms of technical debt? Is that so costly that it's, you know, that the benefit you gain from doing so outweigh, you know, it doesn't outweigh the cost? That's really the question. So, I mean, you know, you can use, you know, X, Y, and Z product forever, as long as that cost benefit analysis is, you know, is in your favor. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that.
Right.
Now, having said that, to Mia's earlier point, you do have to make some sort of considerations before you buy the thing. One of the things that Aaron was saying before, you know, these sort of questions of build versus buy versus reuse and discard. You need to make those I think you need to make those decisions up front, because it's not just the thing you're buying now, it's the thing you're going to keep forever, because that 15%, you know, of time and effort, you know, to buy the thing is just the first part of it. You got O&M forever, right?
Well, but
And
Michael,
so you got to
can
consider.
I just interject a real quick
Sure.
point on that? And so I think everybody on this panel has been in the government in some capacity. And so I just want to say to our audience, because I feel like this is the cone of trust here, right? The reality is, when we talk about vendor lock-in, I often wonder, like, this notion of like, how often is the government swapping out technology? It just doesn't happen often. And so I just want to make that point, because often, right, when we make a technology decision, we are keeping that thing in our Noah's Ark into perpetuity almost, right? There is oftentimes we don't necessarily even think about what the modernization of that thing is 10 years from now when we make that purchase decision. So why is I'm curious about, like, why vendor lock-in even becomes like a part of the conversation.
And even when you, and I'll add this, and even if you got all the ducks in a row to make the transition, you got to get past the federal acquisition regulation, right? You know, you got to get past the procurement cycle, 18, 24 months, you know, to do a full RFX process. So it's like, okay, so you're locked in even after that. Sorry. Go ahead, George.
So Mia, yeah, I took the question completely different, which was the fear of vendor lock-in, meaning if we're going to launch a modernization effort and we want to choose a new low-code platform A, and I get a SI to come in and do that, am I locked into that SI because of the quote corporate knowledge and the history and everything that they're going to use? See, and
I'm more
to
afraid
me,
of that. I'm more afraid of that.
Exactly.
That's where
technology is.
Well, that's
exactly.
No, go ahead, George. I was gonna say, George, that to me, the vendor lock-in idea is so wild, because if you look at almost any of the modern platforms, you get all of your data out, and you can get your data out whenever you want. It's in a structured way. And to what Aaron was saying earlier, if there's a competitor, they're going to figure out how to ingest that data into their system so they can get your business. So to me, the vendor lock-in period is almost comical in the idea that we're also looking at, so are you trying to think that the on-prem versions of what we used to have and what we're trying to modernize from is not a vendor lock-in because it was custom code that was developed and you don't even have people who know how to do that code anymore anyway because they're all retired? Like, no. So the idea of like, it's ownership of your data, and then whatever development you do, are you documenting that in a way that you know how to future-proof it? So it's that SI lock-in I would be more afraid of that SI building and developing, but then not documenting what they built and how they built it and why they built it, so that you can never transition effectively somewhere else. So it almost goes back to me, and like the conversation for later we're gonna have is around governance. It's all a management of the platform and how you're doing it in an effective way and thinking about growth and what's next. In government, it's very hard to think of what's next because we don't fund in government R&D very well. It's almost all O&M. So, but in your thought process of how you as a government are buying and purchasing these platforms, putting into your budget that idea of how do we future-proof this and document what's done and have SIs do that additional step is, I think, wildly important. And that gets that vendor lock-in piece into the reality of like, you're not locked into a vendor, you're locked into what you did on that vendor.
Exactly. And go ahead, Mia, I'm sorry.
So on that
Go
point,
ahead.
I'm going to move us on. We got more questions, but there were some points that were made in our huddle yesterday around this vendor lock-in. And so, Michael, I'm going to quote you that governance starts at procurement. And I love that because I don't think I've ever heard it put that way before. People think that you govern a thing when you're actually, putting code, on a screen, right? And creating things. But I love the fact that you talked about governance starts at procurement, that basically it's your contractual language that helps you to manage the risk of vendor lock-in. And he talked about the forms and formats specifically of like your data and understanding that if you want to leave a platform, how do you get your platform out? He talked about, the data being WC3 agnostic. I mean, there are a ton of, I think, contractual guardrails that the government should almost have as boilerplate language in all technology acquisitions in order to manage the risk, right? You can't avoid it, but manage the risk of this notion of lock-in if you're going to talk about technology. But the same kind of language should also exist in your contracts with your SIs as well, to make sure that when, the clock strikes 12 and they're not there anymore, that vendor, Y now can pick up that new code and be successful. So I'm going to transition us in because I see some questions about ATO, and I promise you that is next. But we've got to talk about data strategy, integration strategy as it relates to no code, low code platforms. And, in my prior role as a CIO, I will tell you that if I could ever go back and do things again, my integration strategy would have been the first thing that I addressed. So often we are out building the application and we worry about the data later. We worry about how the data is going to get there later. And so can we talk, gentlemen, more about like why your integration strategy and data strategy and governance of your data is paramount to using a low code, no code platform well, that it should not be an afterthought? Go. Anybody know this pain point intimately? I certainly can talk about it.
Yeah, I'll start. So I don't even know where to begin on that one. I guess the long and the short of it is, regardless of whether or not this was a low code, no code platform, you'd still have a data problem. You'd still need a cogent data architecture. You'd still need the business to participate in a pervasive data governance strategy. You would still need to rationalize your data sources. I mean, everybody and their mother can't have a data source. There needs to be authoritative data sources. How you serve your data, to whom you serve your data, an API strategy and that integration layer that Mia was talking about a few seconds ago. All those things you'd have to do anyway, regardless of whether or not you had a low code, no code platform. But I think it's even more critical once you do, because, well, you got to make certain decisions about interoperability, and your data integration strategy is going to determine how well you're going to be interoperable. That's kind of the whole point.
Can I just simplify a point that I want to just make known that, like, if you are in a federal government environment that is ripe with legacy applications and you choose a low code, no code platform to as a part of like building and developing mission applications, you should automatically recognize that low code, no code platform that sits in the cloud is always going to go back to your legacy environment, which is the main reason why your data strategy, your integration strategy is critical to your success, why it should not be an afterthought in terms of how you manage, develop, build, and govern your APIs, so that you're not creating additional stress on your organization when it comes down to serving up data, either repeatedly or, ad hoc to some cloud application. I kind of just want to make that point because, again, I find sometimes that the integration is an afterthought. It's not sexy, right? But it's critical. George?
Yes, spot on, Mia. Again, thinking about sitting down with the customer and the client upfront, trying to find out, their pain points and how we're going to help them do that. So on the data aspect, the thought process should be plan for, not react to. Okay, that's just reemphasizing what everybody just said, but plan for what you want that to look like, structure, architecture, et cetera, data-wise, because that is the commodity that is going to try to connect or not allow the connection of everything else. So just putting it with the customer up front that we need a plan for it versus our traditional approach, which is let's just go out there and knock out some configurations and worry about the data as an after fact.
So we're going to move next to security because there's a ton of questions in here about security. But I want to, Matt, I want to get you to put you on the spot. So there was a question that I saw around what's the difference between low code and no code. And so I'm going to put that to my panel. We're going to take that in less than 60 seconds so that we at least establish the ground truth.
I mean, my perspective on it, I think it's about as easily defined as like a platform as a service versus software as a service and infrastructure as a service. It's sort of what it is versus it isn't. I think low code is essentially, you are still creating some code, but it's very minimal. It's really only for some very distinct, specific functionality, but you're talking like not even 100 lines typically when you're doing it. No code is literally where you're dragging and dropping or pressing buttons to configure to say, I need this here, I need this here, but you're not actually doing any coding. The clicks that you're doing are like creating that configuration in the background and pre-approved sort of code. So that's how I think of it. I know that's probably not the most technically accurate, but that's typically how I have talked about it with customers. That no code can do more than I said, but typically it's sort of a very distinct, specific piece of how you want something to functionally happen a little bit differently that wasn't contemplated by that platform provider.
There's another question around anyone on the panel having success implementing a low-code app from another agency, and was the experience encouraging? I can speak to a recent example of a customer for sure. George, do you have, does TSPi had any success in implementing an app from another agency?
Yeah, I can't say no, and the answer is yes, we have done that, and okay. It's a challenge. It's not something that we should be afraid of approaching, because again, you've got the customer needs and expectations. They're just through a recompete of a contract, you pick up the new work and you do your absolute best to ask from that customer what is it that they really want out of this transition, so that as we come in and take over and start delivering on that work, it's that vision that they give us that drives how we implement that new development or that new modernization for them, including key capture of staff, resources, etc. So it can be done. It's just, again, just plan it. If you plan it, it will execute itself. Yes,
for sure. So go ahead.
I think that's one thing that I would encourage people to do. There might be certain constituents on this call that might not love this idea, but whatever. Talking about reusing, do an RFI. Almost every SI out there has built a use case very similar to what you're wanting to at your agency, I bet, at this point. Do an RFI and ask the SIs, we're going to have you for support and O&M, but what can you do to make sure that I'm having the lowest amount of development time and lowest amount of development costs? Because I know that many of you have done this before. And then you'll see which SIs are going to be a little more forthcoming with what they can do and faster to market and built on what they've done in other agencies. But so I think it's a little hard sometimes for us to think that the government needs to be the one sharing this information, because most government employees don't have time, and that's not in their mission. But there are other actors out there who can help make this a real reality and still get benefit from doing that and implementing that at agencies. And I think our SI community has a large ability to sort of help push and drive that reuse, because they're still going to have to implement it, they're still going to have to manage it. But I think there's a real ability for us to push the SI community to start doing more of that sharing. Yes. And acting like it's not all unique development work.
Look, I would love a marketplace where, you know, as the government develops an app for onboarding, an app for an app for, you know, many different things. There's so many use cases that are so common across government, right? Let's just be real, right? There's much of government does the same thing from an operational perspective, yet we spend millions and billions of dollars recreating the same thing, you know, because of this snowflake mentality. And I heard a gentleman say not too long ago, he was like, yeah, but you're still snow. So let's move into security compliance. And there is a question in here. I don't know if it was a bit of a typo, but I want to go back to, who is this? Chris Wallace says, he says, I'm wondering if the conversation is as much about the specific platform as it is about the governance process delivery methodology the development team is constrained with. Might be the tee up for, says, sit dev conversation, but are all development environments the same? And goodness gracious, you know, Chris, you know, the answer to that is no. And I don't know if you mean by all development environments, but I think you're right. I think you can't talk about low code, no code, and not address process delivery methodology, right? The whole objective of using SaaS or PaaS is because it allows you, you know, notionally to go faster, right? And so if your governance process is laden with unnecessary rules, okay, and you don't have a sense of like an agile governance framework, I think you fail, and you, not fail, I think you do not realize the benefit of a low code platform. You know, I often have told customers, and I myself as a customer had to move my entire organization to DevOps in order to really achieve scale, and not just scale in development, but also address the fact that my operations and maintenance environment, my legacy environment, needed to have the same processes, because again, my low code, no code platform apps are still going to go touch my legacy applications. And I couldn't have a different process in O&M than I was having in my development environment. So let's talk now, because I brought up DevOps, and I'm going to say DevSecOps because someone I talked to a few months ago said they only put the sec in it because security felt like they were left out. So let's talk about security. Let's talk about compliance. Let's talk about privacy. We have a lot of security folks right here on this panel. So I'm going to watch the clock on you guys because I know you can go over. But let's start talking about the considerations, right? When you're using low code, no code platform, and like, where does security and privacy fit in the equation? Don't go all at once.
I mean, I guess I can start. One thing that I like to always think about in this is, if we think from the business side of what low code, no code sort of platforms try and say, is that we can transform the way you develop and launch and do apps and make them go so much faster. That's very true. That doesn't mean that there aren't many ways that you can do that very quickly and easily that impact security. And so there's an element of the change dynamic between like business owners being able to develop an application and the need for security to understand how they're developing that application and all the different ways that that can happen very quickly and very easily and correctly. And when we think of the old, sort of the more traditional version of how we did that, the CIO and CISO shops were intimately involved in the development of those applications from the very beginning. Now, when you have business owners who can do it, how is security being brought into that? And I think part of that is really understanding that that's changing the relationship between the business owners and the CIO and CISO shops and how they need to interact. I think one, CIO and CISO shops need to work to better understand the full capabilities of a platform and what is covered and not covered, and then create a governance process of saying, here's a playbook of ways that you can configure things and build an app, and if you follow everything in here, you're good to go. If you do anything that's different, that is a security implementation that we need to do these actions on to make sure you're not doing something wrong. And so I think creating that kind of better harmony between the two, because you could easily have, I'll say example, I'm going to say Matt Goodrich and finance running an application, and all of a sudden I think I'm going to do this because it's easier for me to access this at home. I unbeknowingly create a backdoor to an application for anyone to have access to all of the employees' financial information. It is very easy to do that in a low-code, no-code platform sometimes. Those are rules that should be enforced and not should be able to check. Most of the platforms also have an easy ability to notify when those changes are being done so that you can easily fix it. So it's not like it's hard to find that that was done in the old way, but making sure you have that governance process and that check at the application layer when people can make those changes is a very different dynamic than what we've seen traditionally. And so it requires sort of an upgrade from the business unit end to understand their actions actually are a security action versus a functionality action. Then most functionality actions are a security action. It also requires, I think, the CIO and CISO shops to really better define the rules of the road for those business units and business owners in doing that, and better understanding how they are monitoring those configurations at the application layer that can be very problematic. I mean, if you look at a vast majority of the hacks and breaches that happen, they come from the application layer. So this is an area where understanding how you're actually monitoring and managing that is much more important, I think, than it has been in the past because of the ease of this on these platforms. But I do think the security is much easier to pay attention to with the way these platforms are built out as well. So it's just a transformation on sort of how we're using these platforms, and also transformation in the relationship between security and business.
Yeah, and that transformation is a different way of saying it. I love what Melissa said. She says they say sec DevOps because security needs to come first. And I would tweak that a little bit and just say that this notion of shift left or else, I think, you know, there needs to be like a wholesale adoption across the government of bringing security and privacy at requirements. So often, you know, the culture has been in traditional development shops that, you know, you toss it over the fence and you let security deal with it without really understanding that there is compliance, but there's also assurance, right, that needs to happen. And the way to avoid the pitfalls of delays around assurance is making sure that they are at the table understanding what it is you intend to do from the start. I know Michael and Aaron have a lot to say, so gentlemen, it's 12:50 and we still have citizen development and O&M to cover, so go.
The only thing I was going to say, Mia, was you stole my speech about assurance versus compliance.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you did because you've heard it enough from me before. And there's a big difference between the two, and people often get them confused. They think that just because I've got a FedRAMP authorization means I'm secure. No, it really doesn't. You know, please forgive me, Matt Goodrich, for saying that.
No, I agree. I'm out there preaching the same thing. I agree.
You know, and so, you know, there are assurance efforts with every application that goes into production, but for no-code, low-code platforms, there is this concept of secure configuration and secure configuration standards that have to be, you know, developed, by cybersecurity and enforced by cybersecurity in conjunction with the business.
Yes.
I'll stop talking there because that's a whole other meeting. But I will step back and let Aaron go on.
Yeah, I want Aaron to go into his soliloquy that he went into yesterday. Go ahead, Aaron.
And I think, you know, along the lines of, you know, if we talk a little bit more about the citizen development, you know, agreeing with Matt's approach when it comes to, you know, governance and awareness, to be quite honest, to build out that framework, you need to get those things in place before you hand off a low-code, no-code platform to your citizen developers. You know, I've seen that where, you know, we don't have a process well built, we don't have that governance. It really needs to mirror what we're doing in other DevSecOps opportunities, where we do have the SIs doing, you know, normal Java development, for example. Those same types of best practices need to be followed in this type of an environment. And if you kind of let loose and, you know, let your citizen developers run amok, all you're going to be doing is a reactive approach to this for the length of the time that you've got that function available to that community. So,
Hey, Aaron.
Yep.
I want to just interrupt real quick because we did talk about sharing apps earlier, and I would like for you to kind of enlighten the audience around authority to use.
Yep. So what we've been approaching recently is that same type of reuse model, right? Just because I haven't developed a process or a function to meet, an HR need, a budget or finance need, or even an internal IT need, maybe someone else has already done this. So what are my opportunities to basically reuse systems that have already been developed by other agencies, for example? And so what we're looking at is in that environment that Matt and Michael were speaking of before, where maybe we have, a SaaS or a PaaS where, it's a FedRAMP environment that another agency has ATO'd the front end of this system, and they're utilizing it for a specific function. And that's the exact same function that I need within my organization. Should I have to go through a new FedRAMP process or re-ATO that system? No, if I don't have any outlandish customization that I need to do to utilize that same system that's already been built, then what we're looking at is an authority to use. So we get into an agreement with another agency and say, hey, we want to do the exact same thing you're doing. We want to bring our own business needs into this environment. Can we just become a quote unquote tenant on the platform that you've already authorized to use within our stack? And so this is fairly new for us. I've honestly only been a part of one of these so far that have been successful, but it's really opening a lot of doors for other opportunities where we increase that speed, right? I think it was Matt or gosh, I can't remember the gentleman's name that asked a very similar question in the thread on, with this low-code, no-code environment, how do we get that time to market increase with all of the cybersecurity requirements that are still in place? Well, if we've got these types of opportunities where we've got, an ATU and I'm reusing another agency's environment, that is the best path for us moving forward in 9 cases out of 10. Now, yes, there are still things that we have to work towards, meaning how is that data segregated in that environment between the agencies? What does the ownership, maintenance, and management of that data look like? And things like that, would have been developed if you were building an internal app regardless. But for the most part, all that front end work, right, getting those controls in place, making sure that that environment is quote unquote secured for government utilization, you can knock out 80% of that overhead by utilizing that ATU approach.
You talked yesterday about this inheritance model of cloud, and that government in many cases, and specifically even security teams, right, are still kind of treating cloud applications like it's kind of your typical infrastructure data center applications. And so there is, I do believe there's an education I think that needs to happen, kind of an upskilling, right, of the government in terms of cloud in general, but more so like really getting teams trained on these various platforms across government. One of the things that we're seeing is when customers are building multiple apps on a single cloud platform, they're attempting to ATO them each by each, rather than looking at the platform from a GSS perspective, such that you do get that kind of rapid time to market because you've already kind of covered 70 to 80% of the controls, where it just becomes really easy to get things into production. I want to also, there's been a lot of talk about citizen development, and I think, because I want to go into O&M in our last four minutes, but citizen development, I think you kind of hit on it, Aaron, Matt, you touched on it. We talked yesterday about train first. If you're going to turn the keys over on the platform over to your business users, they need to be trained and they need to get certified. And I say the same for your technical teams as well. Mm-hmm. Training and certification is critical to a citizen in relation to citizen developers, but even your SIs. You should be building expertise within your government organization such that you have experts on the things in your environment and you're not at the mercy of a vendor. So now
I have one thing that just to hammer the point home. Almost every single low-code, no-code platform out there has free training and free ways to show that you have been trained. You don't even have to go through a
Yep.
cert exam, they show it. So for government, where you want people to make sure and training budgets and training rules are hard, it's free. Also, for your SIs, it's an easy requirement to tell them to do it because you're not having to pay them to do it. It's online. So I harp on that because I think almost every platform out there has amazing free training platforms and easy to prove that you've done it. And almost all of them have the ability to technically do things on the platform. It's not just a like written exam. So I will harp on that till the day is long, Mia, with you.
But
Oh,
and
great.
I will say too, that training needs to involve beyond just, from a platform perspective, but what are the internal IT processes that you need to still be following when it comes to like an SDLC? Right, there still needs to be that integration point where those folks need to be trained in that aspect of development, to be quite honest. Yes, low code, no code, but those rules remain regardless of that process to put something to market. Those SDLCs still need to be maintained. There may be, tailoring efforts for a different type of platform and how they actually get pushed. But those citizen developers, or anyone, to be quite honest, who's developing on those platforms, also has to be aware and trained on what those processes are internal to that organization.
Yeah, we talked really quickly about the impact to IT organizations when an agency decides to have citizen developers. And so, the management of your kind of day-to-day operational environment within IT is one thing. But once you unleash citizen developers onto a platform, you still have to consider that you need to look at their requirements to make sure that they are reusing things, the things that they want to do, they're not out there trying to build a brand new finance system or a brand new timesheet system, right? There still has to be governance around what your citizen developers can and should be doing on the platform and guardrails, but you need support. You need resources to be able to support those people. Last but not least, let's talk about O&M and this myth out there that if you go to a low code, no code platform, daggone it, we have a minute. The considerations, we've got a lightning round, 60 seconds. Is there O&M, gentlemen, needed?
Absolutely. Every time you've got a low code, no code platform that has to go through a revision or an upgrade, that is an O&M activity, and it's always constant and in present.
Anybody else?
Got it.
Yeah, I would
Go ahead, Mike.
echo George's sentiment. It has to fit inside of your O&M governance process, your CCBs and all those things that you normally do in order to track, configuration changes. But I would say from a cybersecurity perspective, and I'll just leave you all with this thought, there's, hundreds, if not thousands of documents on DoD websites that talk about STIGs and SRGs for operating systems, for coding platforms and everything else. Not a whole lot of secure configuration documents for no code, low code platforms. I'm just saying.
Awesome. Well, it is 1
That's part
o'clock.
of O&M.
Right. It is 1 o'clock. Gentlemen, thank you so very much for answering my call and participating in this session today. I think it has been great. It looks like the audience enjoyed it as well. Have a fantastic Tuesday and great rest of the week. Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye-bye.
Yep.